Hi, everyone. I gotta find my music. Turn it off. Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's ECM. You know that already. I'm really glad you're here. It's Thursday, the 30th of November, 2023, which means it's the last day of November, which is blowing my mind because one of the things that means is that we're like less than 8 weeks from our 7th anniversary of this broadcast. Which is quite stunning when you think about it. I'm just really glad you're all here. And it's, I have to say that after whatever it is now, we're coming up on 5 months of being back live on YouTube 5 days a week, which is awesome. I'm just really grateful for all of you. I am coming to you, as always, from occupied Tongva territory here in Southern California. And today I'm wearing a navy blue shell type shirt with my dark brown cardigan over top. I have my thick hoop earrings in. My hair is pulled back, and I am a pink-skinned, green-eyed, dirty blonde-haired woman. I'm sitting in my office. I updated my Mac, so I've got this whole new filter system set up on the camera today, which is kind of wild. So if we're a little fuzzy in the background or a little wider, that's why. I've got studio light on today, so I'm a little bit brighter than normal. Okay, so first things first. Overnight, a couple of very kind followers on YouTube asked me if they could potentially have my tip information again so they could kick me some holiday cheer. So I'm just going to stick it up here so you all can see it. Here's my Cash App. Here's my Venmo. I am so grateful to those of you who do this periodically. It makes a huge difference to support me and to support my team. And also you can always become a subscriber over on patreon.com/resistancelive, which helps to support this work on a regular basis. All right. We have so many people here today from all over the world, and I'm not going to go through our usual rundown of potential places, but it's nice to see you all from Pittsburgh to Paris here today. So very grateful for that. All right, we have very big breaking news this morning, which is that the New York Court of Appeals, the New York Appeals Court, because the Court of Appeals, I always have to remind you guys, is the Supreme Court technically. It's the highest level court in New York State. This is the appellate division, and they have reinstated the gag order against Donald Trump that arises out of the New York City civil fraud case. The order itself, notwithstanding the fact that the briefing was incredibly extensive in this matter, is a scant page and a half long. What that tells me is that for reasons that are obvious to everybody who's a viewer here, this is all very cut and dried. They did not need a long explanation. They did not even have to cite a single case. They simply said, the application is denied. The interim relief, which is you all remember, the temporary administrative stay is lifted and the gag order is back in place. So I will tell you, I think this comes not a moment too soon. Those of you who have been paying attention know that Donald Trump threatened Judge Engoron's wife last night on Truth Social, in addition to mentioning the law clerk yet again. And as we've discussed on the broadcast many times this week, there were 274 single-spaced pages of voicemails and other threats that had been sent to the law clerk and the judge's chambers in the window of time that the gag order was not in operation. So this was kind of a no-brainer, and I am really glad it's back in place. We are still waiting on the DC Circuit to rule on the gag order issue out of Judge Chutkin's courtroom, which was subject to oral argument. I think it was, I'm losing track of time because this week has been so crazy. It was either earlier this week or last week. I think it was before Thanksgiving. And we're waiting on a ruling on that. But I have to say that for very similar reasons, I'm expecting that ruling is going to go the same way. I think there will be a gag order reinstated there. It may be slightly narrower than the one that Judge Chutkin issued, but we've seen him just take a mile when he's given an inch every single time one of these gag orders is temporarily stayed. And so we're in a place right now where, the gag order is returned in New York State, not a minute too soon, by the way, because we are coming to the end of that trial, and there will be an order and a ruling coming out of that sometime before the end of the year. So we know that he is going to testify a week from Monday again in that trial. The attacks on the judge's clerk, the judge's wife, are so far beyond the pale now in light of what has happened already. There can be no illusion that Donald Trump knows the impact. Everybody has seen the evidence of the anti-Semitic, incredibly violent threats to rape and murder the law clerk that were submitted before this appeals court. So we're in a situation where at this point, if he violates the gag order again, again, I have to remind everyone that there is the possibility of being held in contempt of court, even in a civil matter. And he's already been fined twice, like very substantial amounts. So we'll have to see what happens there. But, if the gag order is reinstated in DC and he violates that one, given that that is a criminal case, the likelihood is that he will then be subject to everything up to and including pretrial detention until he's tried. So again, I have to remind everybody that he has been somewhat restrained when these gag orders have been in place, largely, I think, because he doesn't want to end up in jail. But this is very, very good news this morning, because we're seeing and understanding from the appeals court of how grave this is, how serious it is, and what's at stake. I don't think anybody could have looked at those 274 pages of evidence and thought that this was a nothing burger, right? We all know what he's capable of inciting. January 6th taught us that. So that's very good news this morning out of New York. Now, there is other breaking news out of New York that everyone should be aware of that raises the specter of something that we talked about here on the broadcast 2-3 weeks ago, maybe. We had a long conversation about the issue of fraudulent conveyance, because there were a lot of people worried about, like, what happens if Trump tries to hide assets once his company is in receivership. Well, lo and behold, this isn't hiding assets, but he's violated Engoron's court order now about the receivership. So let's back up for a second just to fill in the blanks here. You all will remember that at the time that Donald Trump was found, and the Trump Organization and all of the co-defendants were found liable of fraud, which was before the trial even started in New York State. All right. There already been a determination that they committed fraud. One of the things that was contained in Engoron's order was that the Trump Organization and any company that was owned or operated by the defendants was put under the control of a receiver. So what that means is that there is a court-appointed official who is, in essence, managing those companies, including the Trump Organization, to make sure that the assets aren't depleted in advance of a money judgment. All right. Well, one of the things that was in that order set was that nobody could make a transfer out of the Trump Organization or through and beyond the Trump Organization without talking to the receiver first. Trump transferred $40 million to pay a $29 million tax bill. That's at least what some of it went for, without talking to the receiver at all. And the question that's going to come up now is, what are the consequences of that? All right, because there is arguably a legitimate purpose for transferring that money. It doesn't throw us totally into the realm of fraudulent transfer, but then there's the other $11 million and what happened with that. So this has already raised the specter of him violating an order of this court yet again, in this instance with regard to the issue of the receiver. And so we're in a situation where we have to see what Engoron's going to do about it. And while there are ordinarily what are called clawback provisions in the instance of a fraudulent transfer, so let's just say hypothetically that $11 million went from the Trump Organization into Trump's personal bank account or into an offshore account, that money could arguably be clawed back by an effort by the New York court, okay? If it was determined to be a fraudulent transfer designed to evade a looming money judgment, that money could be clawed back. However, the money that's already been paid to the IRS is kind of another story, because that's sort of a legitimate business expense. So we're going to have to wait to see how this plays out. Again, I want people to understand that we have seen time and time and time again that he doesn't comply with court orders. And I will just say that if I were Judge Engoron and I already had security and my law clerk had been threatened with murder and rape, and I had been threatened with murder, and now my wife had been threatened by a defendant, I would not be taking very kindly to any violation of court orders that exists. So we're going to have to see. Again, it's unpredictable at this point what's going to happen. I think the big question right now is, what does Letitia James do about this? Is she going to try to indict him for fraudulent transfer? Is she going to raise it in the context of the ongoing case? Then it's sort of the ball's in her court at this point, unless Engoron decides to act sua sponte, which means of his own volition, on something like this. And it's unlikely that he will do that on the transfer. I would expect, however, that Letitia James's attorneys are going to raise it. He may choose to act sua sponte on the issue of the threats to his wife, and that would be totally legitimate. So again, we've got to see how this plays out. But there's a lot of very significant and frankly potentially debilitating legal news out of New York this morning for Donald Trump. Okay. My list today, I'm just going to tell you guys, is really, really long. So I'm gonna work through it as much as I can. But I want people to understand that, as predicted, it's a very, very busy news day. All right. So I warned everybody that the end of this week was going to be insane. And so just bear with me. There were so many questions this morning on the Patreon feed. Again, I love you guys. Thank you for bringing your questions to me. Thank you for your paid subscriptions. I want to tell you guys, though, that wading through all this morning is a lot because we've got questions on a whole diverse set of topics. So let's just cover the easy stuff first. Today is going to be George Santos's last day in Congress. There's going to be a vote today, and it does appear as of this morning that they have the votes to boot him out. It's only ever happened 5 times before in American history. He's going to be gone. Then there's going to be a special election to fill that seat. I'm going to remind everybody, George Santos represents a district that Biden won in 2020. It's quite possible we will have a Democratic pickup of that seat in a special election, but he will be gone. That's going to happen today. The other thing that we need to talk about this morning, because it bears upon the larger question of social media and information manipulation and disinformation generally, is this absolutely insane interview that Elon Musk gave yesterday at the New York Times Dealbook Conference. Many of you have already seen the footage where essentially he told his advertisers that they could go F themselves. He said it multiple times. It is probably one of the most uncomfortable, cringy moments I've ever seen out of a conference in my life. And then on top of that, he made this really bizarre statement to Andrew Ross Sorkin that was like, Jonathan, you and I are friends. And he said, my name is Andrew. And I have to say that I'm not the first person to point this out, but it looks as though Elon Musk is really decompensating in real time right now. And I don't know what the outcome of that is going to be. He looked extremely hungover yesterday. I'm not the only person to point that out either, as someone who's sober. He's in a very ugly place right now, and he doesn't really seem to be entirely in control of his mental state. Now, I have to tell everybody, I don't think this means anything positive for Twitter. I think Twitter is gone. I don't think it's coming back. And, one of the reasons why Threads is now the place where everybody seems to go for breaking news is because Twitter is nothing but a cesspool any longer of white supremacy and hate speech and Elon Musk getting his ego stroked. So we're really not in a position where we can expect that Twitter's going to come back. And I, at this point, actually really don't want it to. I have to say that my experience on Threads has been so much more positive. It has features that are making it much more easy to use. But the one thing I do want to point out here is that Elon Musk still has control over satellites that are being used in the Ukraine conflict. He still has, very extensive government contracts with the U.S. Department of Defense and NASA, which should raise everyone's eyebrows. And there are ongoing issues related to Tesla, and today's the Cybertruck launch, and various issues with quality control inside Tesla that, in addition to the fact that they're being sued for widespread racial discrimination, there's just so many things that are happening in that realm, and he is self-destructing in real time. So, the fact that there is still a real information ecosphere happening on Twitter should concern everyone. But the good news is that it does seem, at least at this moment and within the last 2 weeks, particularly with the arrival of the president, the vice president, the White House, the Biden campaign, the White House press secretary onto Threads, that, a turning point has arrived where, Twitter's going to die and it's going to be in bankruptcy. And I really think we're kind of beyond the point of no return on that. So folks should be very clear and aware that, the threat is not over. The government contracts in particular raise really serious concerns for me. If anybody hasn't followed what happened with the Starlink satellites around Ukraine and Russia in the last year, you should go Google it, because there were instances where Musk just simply turned off the satellites. Ukrainian soldiers lost the ability to communicate with their supervisors, and people died because Musk talked to Putin, apparently, and Putin didn't want the satellites used for that. There's no circumstance under which any form of U.S. supported military intervention should be subject to Elon Musk's control at this point. And we're going to have to see how this all, again, plays out in the coming days and weeks. But it's very ugly right now, like ugly beyond even what we have seen so far. And I'm not expecting it's going to get any better. Okay. All right. the ceasefire has been extended for another day. That's very good news. We are continuing to see the release of non-Israeli nationals. And we're also continuing to see the release of Palestinian prisoners who've been held in Israeli prisons, including teenagers. And so I'm just going to point that out for the moment to say that the good news about this is that the Biden administration is continuing to do its job. I'm going to also remind everyone that humanitarian aid is flowing over the border from Egypt right now, which is very good news. Truckload upon truckload upon truckload of humanitarian aid. The Biden administration has also warned Netanyahu about initiating future military action in the southern part of Gaza because the humanitarian crisis will increase exponentially. It's already so bad, but will increase exponentially if the area into which so many northern Gazans fled is then subject to bombing and additional attacks. So I just want to point out, again, the Biden administration deserves enormous credit for getting to this point. The extension of the ceasefire is happening purely because of the Biden administration's intervention, and I want credit to be given where it's due. All right, so that's my reason for mentioning that this morning. All right. Other very good breaking news this morning out of the Biden administration. The Biden administration is going to require the replacement of all lead pipes in America within the next 10 years. This is an enormous investment by the federal government, but it will essentially eliminate lead poisoning in drinking water nationwide. I saw this morning, and after watching, many of you have followed Little Miss Flint. You know the entire situation in Flint, Michigan, how thousands of children have been poisoned because of lead pipes. Flint's pipes have still not been replaced. I have to point out that I think this is an incredible action by the administration to really try to rectify what is an incredibly tragic and corrupt situation in Flint and elsewhere. I'm really glad to see it. Again, I think it's something that we've got to tout in terms of what the Biden administration is doing that's positive. We've got to lean hard into that right now as we approach 2024. And it's a very, very good development as of this morning. I also want to point out, by the way, that something like 800 additional student loan borrowers had their debt completely waived this week. Actually, it was more than that. I have the number wrong. It might be $800 million in debt. It's 800 is in there somewhere, but that happened earlier this week. We didn't talk about it yet on the broadcast, but the Biden administration is continuing to find ways to eliminate student debt where it can under the existing current regs. And that's amazing. So we've had some very positive developments over the last week coming out of the Biden administration. Like, please give credit where credit is due. Okay. Okay, now on to some kind of not so hot news. Mehdi Hasan's show has been canceled this morning by MSNBC. And I'm really not happy about this. I happen to think actually that Mehdi is perhaps the most effective interviewer of fascists that we have right now in mainstream media. If you've missed some of his interviews in recent weeks of, right-wing politicians, you should go find them. There has been kind of looming concerns about MSNBC's use of Arab reporters during the hostage situation and the war between Israel and Hamas. And I have to say that there have been indications that MSNBC has not done the right thing here all along, not just with Mehdi Hasan, but also with Ayman Mohyeldin and with Ali Velshi. Their concerns have been raised about this over the last, 51 days since the onset of this war, and this is not a positive development. I also have to point out, they're going to keep him on apparently as an on-air consultant and a substitute anchor, but the elimination of his show is really a tragic loss to, the information ecosphere right now, especially heading into 2024. There's outrage about it this morning on Threads. I'm sure some of you have seen it. And, from the standpoint of what we desperately need right now in terms of pushback and accountability from the media against far-right figures, like Mehdi was doing it better than anyone. And I mean that. He does it better than Maddow. He's really effective at it. And so you can add your voice online or elsewhere to the real outrage about this. I'm so not alone in this. There are so many people this morning, including very senior journalists at other publications and media outlets who are really upset. And it's not good. It doesn't mean that it's irreversible. It doesn't mean that he's gone forever. But I'm also just going to say one other thing, because I saw a couple of people on my feed this morning who were like, well, maybe he'll join X institution that broadcasts on YouTube, or he'll join Y reporter who has a $2.5 million following on YouTube. I just have to point out to everyone, not having Mehdi on mainstream broadcast news is a significant problem, all right? Because one of the things about Mehdi Hasan is that his clips go viral because he is so committed to telling the truth. Like, he's one of the few people who actually managed to hold Vivek Ramaswamy to the fire about his own, taking of a George Soros Foundation fund. Basically, essentially, it was like not a scholarship, but some form of a grant. He held Vivek's feet to the fire about the fact that he made $700,000 a year when he took that grant. And, his interviews of far-right figures have been really sharp. And not having him have a platform like that, like, he can't take to YouTube and make that happen, right? I mean, like, people really need to get their heads screwed on straight about this, by the way. Like, it's great to be on YouTube. I love being on YouTube. I would love to have a show on mainstream media. I'm just going to point this out. Like, YouTube is one thing, mainstream media is another. And nobody should be under the illusion that the kind of like bubbled left, folks that many of you watch, in addition to watching me, are places where Mehdi Hasan can have an impact. All right. Like, I just want people to be really clear about this. All right. He's not clickbait. Like, he's a legitimate traditional journalist and he deserves a massive platform. I'm not suggesting that I'm clickbait either, but I do want to point out that, like, he belongs on television, on a mainstream media site. His role there has been impeccable, and it's a huge loss, and it's a big mistake by MSNBC. So very important to kind of call this out. I would just say tag them on social media and make it loud. All right. We had a ruling out of the New Hampshire Supreme Court today that I was asked to comment on, where the New Hampshire Supreme Court essentially declined to reverse gerrymandering of redistricting in New Hampshire that was designed to keep Democrats out of power. There is a reason for this that is specific to New Hampshire law, but I want to point out something about this that is very significant. Okay, if you do not have control of the state legislature, again, I feel like I've said this so many times here, this is the kind of stuff that can happen, because the reason why the New Hampshire gerrymandering ruling out of their Supreme Court went the way that it did is because the legislature has not passed a law that allows the New Hampshire Supreme Court to review gerrymandering. And if you have a legislature that isn't doing the right thing and that is under the control of the Republican Party, you're not going to have the courts have the ability to do their job. What has happened in the New Hampshire Supreme Court could be overturned with legislation. In fact, the New Hampshire Supreme Court has said this is the role of the legislature. If they want us to be able to do this, they've got to pass a law that says it. So this is yet again a moment where I want people to understand that your local elections and your state elections matter very much right now. I know we're all focused on the 2024 presidential election, the Senate races, the House races, for good reason. But please do not neglect your local elections. Please do not neglect particularly your off-year local elections, because they end up in situations like this. All right. So that's kind of all I want to say about it. It's very specific to New Hampshire law, but it is a larger tale of why it is so critically important that you pay attention to your local elections. All right. Somebody asked a question about school vouchers this morning. We haven't talked a lot about school vouchers here. We've talked a fair amount when Betsy DeVos was, the Secretary of Education. We spent a fair amount of time talking about the efforts to undermine public education in America. So school vouchers are a part of that. And I want people to understand why school vouchers are bad, so that if you are up against a school voucher fight where you live, you know what to say about it. Because there is definitely a push in conjunction with this kind of like anti-woke book banning, eradicate LGBTQ and Black history movement in this country to move in the direction of school vouchers. So here's what school vouchers do. And I'm going to be really blunt about it, because I want people to understand this. And I want them to understand it because, you all know I am a product of private education. I am committed to public education for my children for very good reasons, having to do with my own private education. But I want people to understand that what vouchers do is they take public funding away from public education to give money to parents to pay for private school. And they essentially take the control of education out of the hands of the public, and they start to move more power over to private institutions that are unregulated. All right. And that, by the way, is something that is very consistent with what the far right wants to do. They don't want there to be truthful public education. They don't want public education to be well funded. And also, for many of them, this is another form of grift because they have friends who run private schools. They have friends who have started far right private schools, and they want that money going into their friends' pockets and not into public education. So school vouchers are dangerous to public education. They're also, by the way, dangerous to teachers. And it is an effort that is underway as we see more and more teachers, and the UFT in particular, which, by the way, is run by Randy Weingarten, who I have the privilege of knowing, who is an incredible advocate for the teachers union generally. They're an effort to also bust unions, because if you are taking funding away from public education, you also end up losing teachers. And that gives public schools and people who are invested in this, and sometimes the legislature and sometimes folks like Ron DeSantis, a bigger reason to fire public teachers who are invested in unions. So it's a very complicated network and web of lies, deceit, and grifting. But if you are up against a school voucher push where you live, the easiest talking point to it is that it works to the detriment of every child to move money out of publication and into a school voucher program. All right. And, you can say a lot more about it, but I want people to also understand that it is truly part of the web of attempts to decimate public education in this country, which, by the way, redounds to the far right. Because if there is no adequate public education, people don't learn to be critical thinkers. They're not taught the truth of American history. They don't gain an understanding of white supremacy and indigenous genocide and everything else that, makes up the entire history of America. And they grow up to think that, that's the way that it is. So I want people to really understand the significance of fighting for public education in every way possible right now. And, I will just add to this. This goes down to things like fighting Moms for Liberty, who are also very deep in the school voucher fight. So, get very, very clear on this and understand, why it is that there's a move for this in many jurisdictions right now. Okay. All right. There was a little bit of a news last night. Somebody mentioned this. So Alex Wagner's show opened on a very kind of odd note. I think she was having trouble with her teleprompter, but there was a reference to a case that is taking a long time to litigate where Donald Trump has asserted presidential immunity. And there's been an assertion of presidential immunity in relation to January 6th. So I just have to point out something to everyone. There is no such thing as like blanket presidential immunity. And we've talked about this here before on the broadcast, but I want to make it very clear. All right. Immunity, as it is generally accepted to inure to the presidency, relates to things like executive privilege, which is essentially where conversations that the president is having with his or her or their advisors about, let's just say hypothetically, an international conflict and what to do about it cannot then be admitted into court if someone dies as a result of the policy choice that is made. All right. And there is a justification for that, because what it says is that the president, as the chief executive, needs to be able to consider the pros and cons of any major decision that they're making. And if there is a threat that the president will then be sued as a result of that, that is going to arguably impact the president's ability to be impartial. All right. There is no such thing as blanket presidential immunity. And so this idea that, like somehow there's going to be presidential immunity for trying to overthrow the federal government is just like BS of the highest order. All right. I also want to point out that while there are certain kinds of immunity that do inure to government officials when they're acting in their official capacity, there is no argument here that anything that Trump was doing in furtherance of his reelection campaign is in any way subject to that. All right. So we've got to get very clear on the kind of doctrines that are in play here from a legal perspective. The fact that the case is taking a long time to come to fruition doesn't mean necessarily that there's going to be a positive ruling for Trump. I mean, I have to remind you guys, some judges, for whatever reason, are very lackadaisical about their docket. I mean, I've told you guys the story that there was a case that I was involved in that took 11 years to get a ruling, and it took 4 years to get a ruling on a motion to dismiss, which, as you all know, if you've been following here, is like the earliest motion you can file in a case. And the judge who oversaw that case on the Southern District of New York was blazed all over the front page of the New York Times for how poorly he was managing his docket. I'm not surprised, even still looking back on it, given his reputation and what he was known for. But nobody should think that simply because there is a lag in decision making in a given case or a given trial, that means that there's some positive ruling coming from Donald Trump. All right. It may mean the judge is not doing their job, but it doesn't mean that there's like a positive ruling coming. All right. So we've got to get very clear on this. All right. I just want to mention one other thing here because, this question kind of like raises it. So Amy's just saying here, why does every assertion have to be litigated? Well, you can make any argument that you want in court. There are limits to that, right? Like you all have heard me talk about federal Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, which says that you have to have a legitimate basis in law or fact to make an assertion in a civil case in federal court. You, the lawyer, have to have a legitimate basis in law or fact to make the argument. Trump's lawyers have walked right up to the edge of sanctionable conduct in the way that they have flooded the courts with motions papers. I'm not the first to point this out. It was discussed last night on MSNBC. However, one of the things that I want people to understand is that it's a very routine litigation strategy to overwhelm the other side with paper. I used to do it all the time. In fact, it was like a very effective thing to do in civil litigation, where if you knew the other side was weak, you knew that their lawyers weren't up to snuff. You knew that you had an argument that was far better, that you could split into like 3 different briefs, right? Like you would do that because eventually people make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, they lose. And so that is one way that you can effectively advocate for your client. There's nothing wrong with Trump raising arguments that aren't frivolous, and he can raise as many of them as he wants, right? And he has a right, like that's what due process is all about. He has a right to have those issues heard in front of a court of law. So, especially in the cases where he's a criminal defendant. I mean, in every case, but especially in those cases. So this is how it's going to go. And, at some point they're going to tread over into territory that's frivolous and they might get sanctioned. But that doesn't mean that, like they don't have a right to make the argument. Okay. So that's that. It is very much a throw the spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks situation right now with Trump's legal team. I'm not going to represent to anybody here that I think they're doing a great job, because they're not. But at the same time, we have to understand the principles of, constitutional due process, rights, like the way the litigation system works in this country, both criminal and civil, and to make sure that, we grasp that if we take away rights for Donald Trump, we take them away for everyone else. And that's not what we want. All right. DeSantis and Newsom are debating tonight in a kind of, how shall I call it? I want to call it kind of like a surrogate debate because it's not like DeSantis's campaign is doing well at the moment. And Gavin Newsom is a surrogate for the Biden campaign. Like everybody should be very clear on this. The reason why this is happening is because Newsom can say things that Biden can't. And he's a very effective advocate, particularly on Fox News. Like he's been interviewed by Sean Hannity, who is moderating the debate tonight. And he has not given an inch when Hannity has asked him questions that are grounded in like fraudulent facts, really like miserable arguments of law. Like Gavin Newsom is really good at this. And I think there is an argument to be made that it's important for this to be happening, if only to shut down all the far right talking points that Ron DeSantis gets to spew whenever he wants with no pushback on Fox News. I'm going to add that I think it's important whether or not DeSantis is a candidate or not, because the talking points that DeSantis is using in Florida are being used by the far right everywhere else. So I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to watch it. I have to say that I'm a little bit burnt out after 3 Republican debates. I'm not planning right now to live thread it. So I'm just going to warn you guys on that because I find it very difficult, particularly when Sean Hannity is interviewing people, to put up with the nonsense. So we'll see how it goes tonight. I may watch it. I may not. Bear with me if not. And, you know what? Bye. I have to say, sometimes there are comments that come up on the feed here where I have these moments where I'm like, if I'm talking too fast for you, you're welcome to like scroll back on the recording and like listen to it again. But there's nothing wrong with my pace of speech, and personally insulting me because I'm talking fast is not going to fly here. All right. So let me just say one other thing here. I think whether or not you choose to watch it should depend on your bandwidth. All right. As with everything else, there are things that are going to happen tonight that are going to be outrageous. There are comments that are going to be made tonight that are going to be really triggering. And you should decide whether or not you have the room for Sean Hannity and Ron DeSantis to try to run roughshod over Gavin Newsom. I can guarantee you that whatever Gavin Newsom does effectively is going to go viral, because it always does. So you should be able to do whatever you're comfortable with in relation to tonight's events without feeling guilty about it. All right. Like, don't feel like you have to watch it. All right. Okay. Final thing that I want to talk about today is, a very interesting question that was asked this morning on the Patreon feed about what you do when a community that you're in or a group that you're in is kind of saying that politics is a no-no. All right. And I will tell you that where I live, this has been a major issue for me since I moved here out of New York 5 years ago, because in New York, you can talk about anything. And it's one of the reasons why I miss New York, like, tremendously, right? Because like everybody expects you to be loud and bombastic and have an opinion. Here, when you try to talk about politics in some environments, people shut you down, or they won't talk to you, or they literally will like tell you to stop. And it's interesting to me always where those voices come from, because often there's an entertainment of far right talking points, but there's not an entertainment of people who are on the left. And so one of the things that that I want people to kind of think through when you're in that environment, where you're in a situation where someone says, well, we don't talk about politics here, whether it's coming from someone who is arguably blue, whether it's coming from somebody who is arguably red. The response to that is the most effective response is, here's why it matters that we talk about this. Okay. So I'm going to point out, you all know that I've had run-ins in my parent chats because I've been really public about this, that, in every election that has loomed here since I moved here, I go into the grade level parent chats for my kids and I remind people of why it's so important to vote. And particularly in the last election, in the midterms, I got very, very vocal about the threat to abortion rights. And I got very, very vocal about it from the perspective of what it would mean if, God forbid, one of our children was the subject of a sexual assault and couldn't obtain an abortion. And that upset a lot of people in the parenting chats, to the point where I was asked to just stop talking about it. And my response to that was, well, I hope it doesn't happen to any one of us, but it's really important that people understand what's at stake. And I dialed back a little bit after I was explicitly asked by the moderator of that chat. But I didn't stop, right? And I want people to understand this. Like, I still went back to that chat when I went to the school board meeting a few weeks ago to advocate on behalf of LGBTQ students and like why we need the pride flag in classrooms. I went into that chat and I reported on what happened. And it still got like 9 likes out of 60 parents, right? It's really important that we continue to not allow ourselves to be silenced, and to understand that when people are saying politics is a no-no, that's because they don't understand the need for discomfort, right? Those of you who have been here with me for a very, very long time have heard me talk about how critically important it is right now, particularly for white folks, and, for men to get comfortable with being uncomfortable in the conversations that are being had. Because if we allow ourselves to be silenced for the sake of other people's comfort, nothing changes. And, or for the sake of our own comfort, by the way, like, I have to say that as well. Like, it's really important to understand that our own discomfort and the discomfort of people around us is a critical facet of creating change, right? Like, I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm not bothered by the fact that like the parent chat doesn't like me sometimes. I was run out of another one the first year that I was here, and that's not going to happen again. I've sort of sunk my stake into the ground that I'm not leaving. I guess they could kick me out if they wanted to, but I'm not leaving. And I will think through the battles that I'm going to pick, but I'm not going to not pick battles, because I think it's really important that, particularly in environments that are dominated by people of privilege, people understand why it is that they need to get involved and why they should be invested. And one of the nice things that's been happening as I have continued my own commitment to that is that I have found that I have a lot more allies who are staying silent than I would have otherwise guessed. And when I raise my voice, I find other people are actually on board and just not saying so. So we really very much need to be refusing, honestly, the instruction that we don't talk about politics here, or politics are a no-no in this group, or we're not talking about politics at the dinner table. Honestly, that is an internalized enforcement mechanism for all the things that we're fighting against. And when we allow ourselves to be put in the place of feeling unwelcome and yet continuing to speak anyway, we're actually pushing the needle. And the consequences to that are not mild. I don't want to, discount the fact that like people have lost family members and, to the Trump cult and everything else over the last 7 years. And that's something that people are grieving and that is very difficult to process. But at the same time, we can't stop, right? Like we just can't stop. So I want to very much encourage you to continue finding places to make yourself heard. And that doesn't mean that you might not modify it for a given circumstance, right? Like you've all heard me talk about deep canvassing here ad nauseum. You have to figure out what people's needs are. You have to find ways to meet them where they are. You have to be persuasive, not like using the battering ram of beating people over the head, because that usually causes people to go into fight or flight. Again, this is a very refined set of skills, but the thing you cannot do is just shut your mouth. All right. So that's my response to that. And I feel like it's a really important topic to be talking about now as we head into 2024. I think it's profoundly important that we once again stretch our bandwidth for discomfort. And a lot of us in this audience who have been doing this work for the last 7-8 years and beyond, you all know I've been an activist since I was 15. I've pissed people off for a very long time. But we've got to once again be engaged in stretching that bandwidth of discomfort, right? You've got to be willing to make people uncomfortable and to be uncomfortable yourself in order to make a point, right? That doesn't mean you do it in a way that is abusive. It does mean, however, that you've got to be willing to continue talking about what matters, talking about the issues, trying to find ways to meet people where they are, particularly people who at this moment are burnout and disengaged. I'm not talking about people in the Trump cult. I'm talking about people who are really burnout, disengaged, who are saying like, oh, I can't even pay attention anymore to all this. It's just too much. You've really got to find a way to kind of like continue the conversation. All right. That's it for today. I'm going to warn everybody, tomorrow's going to be a really big day. I'm going to remind everybody, if you have questions about what's happening, head on over to patreon.com/resistancelive, become a paid subscriber. I also will remind everybody, because I was asked about this overnight, that if you want to send me a little bit of extra holiday cheer, you can Cash App me, you can Venmo me. Grateful to the folks who have done that. Every little cup of coffee makes a difference. I will just add one other thing here that, tomorrow's going to be nuts and people should be prepared for it, because we have essentially an all-day hearing in Judge McAfee's courtroom about looming motions related to the various prosecutions that are ongoing in Fulton County. And that's going to be a very significant day. We also are winding down the fraud case now in New York State. We're approaching the final week of testimony. And we're waiting to see what Engoron's going to do about the most recent threats to his wife and his law clerk. In addition to the fact that the gag order, of course, has been reinstated. And then we're still waiting on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals decision on the gag order out of Chutkin's courtroom. And we've got motions practice like all over the place right now in the federal criminal trials. So we're not ending this week quietly. And we're heading into December. And I just have a feeling that like the whole month is going to be chaos. So be prepared. That's all I'm going to say about that. All right. I will catch you all here live tomorrow, regular time. Progressive Coffee Hour is back on Sunday morning this week for our Patreon subscribers. So if you want to join us for that, it's super fun. It's actually like one of my favorite events that I do during the week for work. Please get on over to patreon.com, become a paid subscriber. You can join us on Sunday morning for coffee at 8:30. You can ask me anything. And 8:30 a.m. Pacific, 11:30 a.m. Eastern. And I will see all of you tomorrow, or if not before. All right. Take care of yourselves. Have a great Thursday, and I'll see you soon. All right. Bye.